Okay, this is Unit 5, Notes 1, the South expands. I'm going to deal with two things. First, during the 1820s up through to the 1860s, the expansion of the plantation system into the Deep South. Secondly, we're going to look at the impact that this expansion had on black and white societies in the South. So we're going to talk about slavery. Slavery originated in the 13 colonies in the Chesapeake and Virginia and Maryland, and it expanded into South Carolina. American slavery is going to mature on the cotton plantations of the Deep South. And you can see the graph shows the explosion of cotton production in the 1800s. And you can see this on a map right after the Revolution. You can see that slavery is still centered around the Chesapeake and South Carolina. By 1830, the center of slavery is shifted a little bit further west to Georgia and Alabama. And by 1860, the center of slavery has shifted to Mississippi and Alabama, and the whole institution has kind of been tugged west and southward by the expansion of cotton. The effect on the slave trade, well, in 1809, the international slave trade was finally ended in the United States. The Deep South is going to turn to the Upper South. So if you remember, at the Constitutional Convention, it was agreed that the international slave trade would end in 1808. That went into effect in 1809. And the Deep South is going to turn to the Upper South for its slaves. So this is a chart from your book, and what it shows is the numbers of slaves per year that were sold from the Upper South, which would be states like Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. And these states are sold to the Deep South states like Alabama, Mississippi. So that graph that we just looked at, which from about 1790 to 1860, you're talking about 1 million slaves being moved from the Upper South to the Deep South. 40% of those slaves were transferred. What that means is their owner left the Upper South as well, and the slaves went with their owner. 60% of that number, so about 600,000 slaves, were actually sold into the South. For some Upper South plantation owners, that is an economic necessity. For other plantation owners, it's a way to make money. The effect on slave families is devastating. About a quarter of all slave marriages were broken up, and families were broken up because of this internal slave trade. But despite all these obstacles, slaves in the Deep South will get married again, and they will also kind of adopt children as their own to maintain family structures on cotton plantations. In terms of white masters, some masters in the Upper South are going to see themselves as benevolent masters. What that means is they see themselves as being kind to their slaves. Some slaves in the Upper South do have a superior status, and a lot of these so-called benevolent masters claim that they're only going to sell the troublemakers down to the Deep South. In terms of this trade that goes from the Upper South to the Deep South, very few Americans question it in the South. And you can see here's a graphic of a slave auction. About 3,000 Southerners owned more than 100 slaves. That's not a huge number. It's a small number of people in the South. It's an unusually high number of people in terms of wealth in the United States. So we want to make a point. A lot of the richest men in the United States right before the Civil War were slave owners. But understand that this wealth did not trickle down into the rest of Southern society. There are two groups of plantation elite. The older group is the group that is centered in the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, and in South Carolina. And they raised tobacco, rice, and sugar. The newer group grew cotton. They lived more modestly. Their capital was tied up in slaves and land. The Upper South aristocrats, we saw a big development in them in the 1700s when they began to act more and more like the English aristocracy. They believe that their version of republicanism is the true spirit of the American Republic, and they did not approve of all the changes that had happened to Northern society that we have talked about. The political changes, the economic changes with the market revolution and the industrial revolution, and the social changes that we talked about last class with the reform movements. These folks were located on the outer edges of the South. So if we look at the South as a geographic unit, these guys are on the periphery. They're on the outside. The Chesapeake is the very northern part of the South, and Louisiana and the sugar plantations would be the furthest west. They're going to be the ones who take the lead in defending slavery. So this is the old plantation elite. Now, the way they defend slavery is a little bit different. In the early 1800s, you get people like Thomas Jefferson apologizing for slavery, calling it a necessary evil. By the 1840s and the 50s, a very different message. We're going to protect slavery and argue that it's a positive good. Some of the old aristocracy in the South are going to take this ideology to heart. What we mean by that is they really do start paying a little bit more attention to their slaves. They're going to build them new cabins. They're going to paint their cabins, whitewash them. They're going to welcome preachers into their midst. And there's definitely mixed motives here. Certainly they're hoping that they can control their slaves better. They're not just doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. The new aristocracy, the people from the Cotton Belt, much less hypocrisy and less elegance with them. The nature of their crop, cotton required constant work. Year-round work. So what we're going to see is a more demanding schedule on the slaves who were on cotton plantations, compared with, say, tobacco, where a couple of months in a year there might be a lull in terms of the plantation activity. It's going to be quite demanding on cotton plantations, and the nature of the slaves' work is going to change. Most cotton plantations were organized into a gang system where different groups of slaves had a task to accomplish. The skill level of what they're doing is pretty low, and the pace is quick. The slaves don't have a whole lot of control over what they're doing. We could compare this, actually contrast it with, say, tobacco plantations where the pace might be a little slower, and the slaves would have some degree of control over the work that they were doing. Part of the slave system, of course, had always involved violence. Most historians agree that cotton production involved more violence than other crops. Most Southern whites did not own slaves. And actually, the closer we get to the Civil War, the truer this statement is. So in the 1830s, 36% of whites owned slaves. That had gone down to 25% by 1860. And there's a big variation in geography. In the cotton growing areas, about 40% of whites would own slaves. In the backcountry Appalachian Mountains, as few as 10% would own slaves. If we look at this from the other side, what we see is, look at it from the white perspective. Most whites did not own very many slaves. So 20% of slave owners owned 20 slaves or more. 20% of slave owners owned 6 to 20. And most slave owners owned 1 through 5 slaves. Now, if we look at it from the other point of view, if we look at it from the African American point of view, most slaves lived on big plantations. So let me repeat that. Look at it from the white point of view. Most whites only owned 1 to 5 slaves. But from a slave point of view, most slaves were on big plantations. So if you look at the green numbers here, all right, I did this in class and I just decided to save it a few years ago. What I did is I wrote down the number of slaves. So there's a bunch of imaginary plantations, and this one's the biggest. It has 60 slaves. This is 10, 10, 10, etc. Now, if you look from a white perspective, most of the whites only own a few slaves. If we flip this around, most of the slaves are on one plantation. Many southern whites fled planter-dominated counties, sought farms in the Appalachian Hill Country and beyond in western Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and the southern regions of Illinois and Indiana. Moving north and further west did offer the chance to own land, where being free and being a farmer was seen as being more respectable than in the South, where the goal was always to own slaves. South in context. By the 1850s, the South, if we take 100 as the average standard of living number for someone in the United States in the 1850s, the South is lagging behind. Cotton production is making the very wealthiest Southerners very, very rich. It's not doing a whole lot for the rest of the South. This is kind of an unfair comparison, though, because by comparing the South to the Northeast, we're comparing the South to one of the most wealthiest areas in the world at this point. So we should see the South in a world context, and that's a little bit better. So if we compare the South to the Northeast, the South is lagging behind. But if we compare, for example, if we compare the number of railroads in the South with the northern part of the United States, it doesn't look good. The northern part of the United States has way more railroads. However, if we compare it to the rest of the world, in the 1850s, the South would place number 6 if we were ranking miles of railroad track laid. So if you compare it to the world, the South isn't doing so bad. Another example would be production of pig iron. Compared to the Northeast of the United States, it's terrible, but compared to the world, the South wasn't doing too badly. However, most Southerners realize that their farm, agricultural-based economy fails to raise the living standards of the entire population, and you get some Southerners who are calling, some Southern Whigs by the 1850s are calling for investment in canals, roads, that kind of thing. Overall, slavery discouraged economic diversification, and land and slaves are going to be tied up in capital, and the immigrants are going to head to northern cities. So the South is going to expand during this time period, but the South really is an economic colony of the North.